Welcome to App Stories, a weekly exploration of the world of apps. Today's show is brought to you by Flight Logger, an iOS app for real-time flight tracking and worry-free travel. I'm John Voorhees, and with me is my co-host, Federico Viticci. Hi, Federico.
Hey, John. How are you?
I'm doing all right. It's been an interesting week. We saw an acquisition this week, that was very unusual. Apple bought Texture, which is kind of a Netflix for magazines.
Mm-hmm.
And we'll maybe talk about the details of it a little bit more later, but it was unusual because it was a press release, which Apple doesn't usually do. Usually their acquisitions are fairly quiet. So it got both of us to thinking about maybe we should talk about some of the apps and acquisitions that Apple has done over the years.
Right, especially because most of the time they just confirm acquisitions with a boilerplate text of Apple acquires smaller technology companies from time to time and all that. And in this case, there was a press release, which doesn't usually happen because Apple likes to say, we don't make big acquisitions and we don't talk about what we're doing. But in this case, there was a press release and there were details shared by Eddie Q at South by Southwest, the conference, saying how they plan to integrate the product within Apple News. So a lot of details that we don't usually get for Apple acquisitions. And you had the idea of doing a retrospective of sorts about the companies and the apps and the services that Apple acquired in the past, which I thought was interesting to do.
Right. And it was particularly interesting and unusual that Texture was announced in a press release because it's not a particularly large acquisition. But I think Apple uses it as an important one, which is undoubtedly why there was a press release. And I always know what I think is going to be a good topic for a show when you and I just start going back and forth on iMessage and brainstorming what we're going to talk about, because we started thinking about all the companies and all the products that Apple has acquired over the years. And what we decided we'd do is not concentrate on the entirety of the universe of acquisitions that Apple has done that we know about, but concentrate instead on actually apps and apps that have been acquired by Apple, whether it was part of a company or just a sale of the product, whatever it is, but one where the app was kind of at the center of the transaction.
Right.
When I was thinking about this, I go all the way back to one of the earliest acquisitions of an app by Apple, which is FileMaker, which is still around. And FileMaker is a very interesting acquisition because FileMaker, to this day, I believe, is still a subsidiary of Apple.
Yes.
It was not actually absorbed into the company itself. It's run as a separate company, basically. And it was acquired way back in 1988. It was acquired as part of Claris, which was, at the time, a subsidiary that was doing apps for the Mac like ClarisWorks.
Yeah.
And that's really one of the earliest ones that I can think of. But it's not alone. Before we got to the iPhone, we had a number of these different kinds of acquisitions. There was a SoundJam MP, which is what ultimately became iTunes. And if you go to Panic's website, they have a really interesting story because Panic made an app called Audion, which was also an MP3 player for the Mac. And Apple contacted them and tried to acquire Audion. That didn't actually end up happening.
Right.
And instead, Apple purchased SoundJam MP and turned that into the original iTunes 1.0 in 2001.
Yeah, and the story is excellent because it's I think it's written by Cable Sasser of Panic, and he's an excellent writer when he shares these stories. And I thought it was funny, like all the exchanges, first via email and then in person with Steve Jobs.
Right.
And I highly recommend you go read the entire story. There were some fascinating tidbits, like I didn't know that it used to be sort of common practice in software development, especially in the late 90s and early 2000s, to release products in Japan with a different name. So I think Audion was released in Japan as Mac MP3 because Japanese customers liked this kind of separate identity for tech products and for software releases. And there were, of course, all the quotes from the emails with Steve Jobs, an exchange between Cable and Steve at Macworld 2001, I think. So it's a really fascinating story. And Panic, had they sold Audion to Apple, and maybe if they had gone to work at Apple, maybe it wouldn't be around today. So that's super fascinating.
Yeah, it really was. And it's, at this point, iTunes has been, we've talked about iTunes. It does have its issues. It's been around for a very long time, since 2001, I guess, with 1.0. Another Mac acquisition was an app called eMagic, which became Logic Pro, which is what I edit this podcast on. It was originally set up as a subsidiary just like FileMaker, at least according to Wikipedia, in 2002. And then, ultimately that engine that is used in Logic worked its way into GarageBand. So, it wasn't just an acquisition of Logic itself, but it was then the underlying technology rolled out as part of GarageBand as well.
To give you an idea of how old these acquisitions are, because 2002, it doesn't, at least to me, it doesn't feel like a long time ago.
Right.
But that's 16 years ago. And so you can go to the Apple Newsroom website where they incorporated all of these old press releases that were never published on their Newsroom website, which was launched, I think, a couple of years ago. But you can go in there and you can scroll back all the way to late 90s and find these old press releases. And at the bottom of the press release for Apple acquires eMagic, the text that Apple puts at the very end of each press release to describe what Apple does?
Right.
Here's the description from 2002. Apple ignited the personal computer revolution in the 70s with the Apple II and reinvented the personal computer in the 80s with the Macintosh. This is before the iPhone. This is in many ways kind of before the iPod was a worldwide global phenomenon.
Right.
This is the old Apple. They're mentioning the 70s and the 80s. Because, of course, the 90s, not much success there.
No. Yeah, and it's interesting to look at the evolution of that paragraph, that boilerplate paragraph. And I think our friend Stephen Hackett has some articles on 512 Pixels where he's gone through and documented some of the changes over the years. And it's interesting because it's a little window into what Apple wants the rest of the world to think of it or know about it.
So to move on to the more recent memory, I think 2006, I think Apple acquired CoverFlow. And CoverFlow was this plugin for iTunes that allowed you to, and also I think for the Finder, that allowed you to browse your music as a 3D carousel, or like a CD collection that you could flip through album cover art. And it was really fancy, it was really good looking. And it was incorporated into iTunes, into the Finder, and even in the original iPhone. It found its way into the iPod interface, and it was made by a single guy. I think the company used to be called Steel Skies. There's still, actually, you can go to steelskies.com/CoverFlow, and you will see the original landing page saying that CoverFlow has been acquired by Apple.
I know.
And eventually, Apple was actually sued by some company, I don't remember, for one of the patents behind CoverFlow, and I think Apple paid some kind of settlement, although I'm not sure. But CoverFlow has a complicated history, and very famously, Steve Jobs was an absolute fan of CoverFlow, which was eventually removed, I think, with the music app in iOS 7 that got rid, with the simplification of the UI, that got rid of CoverFlow.
Right. They moved to a grid-style view of album art, which right now, the only place you can find CoverFlow, I believe, anymore is in the Finder. It's still there. I don't really use it myself, but you can. It's a little bit like Quick View because you can just browse through thumbnails of files, which it's handy, I guess, for things like music or photographs, that sort of thing, or maybe videos. But that's the only place it exists now because it was also taken out of iTunes on the Mac with iTunes 11, and we're on iTunes 12 now. So it's, it had its day. It was, as you said, Steve Jobs was a really big fan of it. Today, all we've got left is the Finder.
Yeah. So what is, we're now moving to the just a few years ago. What is HubStop that Apple acquired in 2012?
Yeah, that's an interesting app. It's not one that I was familiar with at the time. It's a transit app, and what it did was it would show you the schedule for buses, for instance, and it would give you all the stops. So if you're in a city that you weren't familiar with, you could see as the stops went by how close you were getting to your destination. And then it also had walking and biking directions for only like 3 or 4 cities in the United States. It was a pretty limited app, but you can see where it was going because it was acquired in 2012, which is the same year that Apple Maps debuted, right? Yeah. So I think this was more probably an acqui-hire with, getting the engineers who were working on solving these kinds of problems so that they could roll out and expand Apple Maps as quickly as possible. Because, even today, Apple Maps is really behind Google Maps in a lot of parts of the world, and it was certainly very far behind in 2012.
Yeah, looking at the screenshots of Upstop for iOS 6, this app had all the UI conventions of iOS 6.
Right.
Really dark interface, blue accent colors, linen backgrounds used throughout the app, and a tab bar that was really chunky with really thick icons. This was really a different era of UI design on iOS, which some people still think it looks better than iOS 11 that we have today, but that's a different topic.
Yep.
Of course, the biggest acquisition when it comes to apps on Apple platforms, I think arguably, if it's not Beats Music, I would say it is Siri, that Apple acquired actually in 2010. So we're going a little back in the past, but it debuted on the iPhone 4S as a native feature in 2011. And Siri, it used to be a third-party app on the App Store. You wrote a post a few days ago on Mac Stories about a comparison between the original Siri demo video for the Siri app and the actual Siri that we have today.
Right.
That sort of illustrates all of the problems with Siri's evolution throughout the years. It's been a strange path that Siri went through, which has kind of been confirmed by this report from the Information website earlier this week of all the struggles, all the internal conflicts with the Siri team within Apple.
It's an interesting story that the Information had, and it rung true with me. I mean, we obviously can't know what's happened inside of Apple on Siri, but it seemed very plausible. And what I think is really interesting about Siri is that it wasn't a third-party app for very long. Apple acquired it, and it didn't do like what it did with Workflow, which we'll get to, and just leave Siri as an app you could download on the App Store. They immediately put it into iOS, but left the name. So Siri still lives on in the name, but not in the app itself.
Yeah, and so many people were, I remember at the time, Siri was very popular in Silicon Valley. It was being observed by different companies. But when Apple acquired it, many folks thought that Apple would change the name. Instead, Apple established the Siri brand as the assistant for the iPhone and eventually all other Apple devices, which makes it even more difficult today. If Apple were to make a new assistant or rebuild their assistant from scratch, there's the question of, does Apple want to change the name of Siri? Because maybe in a way the Siri brand has been associated with problems. But I don't think that is possible. It's like, would you want to change the iPhone name? Because Siri now is just something that people immediately recognize.
Right.
For better or worse.
Thanks to Flight Logger for supporting App Stories this week. Air travel can be stressful. Flight Logger is an iOS app that reduces the stress of travel by making it simple to search and save your flights. Get up-to-the-minute notifications of any changes to gates and terminals, share your travel plans with friends and family, and a whole lot more. So many flight tracking apps are a cluttered mess. Flight Logger is different. Its design reduces the number of taps and information you have to input. Combine that with a clear, glanceable timeline of your itinerary, and Flight Logger is the perfect companion for the modern traveler. Flight Logger is packed with innovative features. It has real-time flight tracking of over 1,500 airlines and 30,000 airports worldwide for worry-free travel. Add flights in-app or by forwarding flight confirmation emails to Flight Logger. Track departure and arrival times, delays, cancellations, and gate and baggage claim information. Receive flight status notifications on your iOS devices and Apple Watch. Track flights on your Apple Watch and other iOS devices with iCloud Sync. You can even view the approximate location of your aircraft during flights. And it's really nice to be able to keep family and friends up to date about your travels by sharing the details with them from Flight Logger. You can also organize flights by trips, so you only see the information you need when you need it. The spring and summer travel seasons are just around the corner. Make your life easier with Flight Logger. There's a link in the show notes to learn more. Use it so Flight Logger knows that you came from App Stories. Thanks again to Flight Logger for supporting the show.
The next acquisition I do remember, because at the time, we're talking about Chomp.
Right. I thought you might have some thoughts on this.
Yes.
This was right when you were really starting to cover a lot of iOS on Mac Stories.
This was when I started to cover a lot of iOS topics and apps. And I was really into the idea of The App Store is growing bigger and bigger. We're approaching the 1 million apps milestone. I think at the time there were 700,000 apps on the store. And I started thinking, how does Apple curate this store? How do they can they make recommendations? How can they help people navigate their way throughout this immense catalog of apps? And Champ was this third-party sort of app store interface that allowed you to discover apps, but outside of the main app store app made by Apple. So it was a third-party storefront, essentially, that featured various types of recommendations. So there were like curated collections by the Chomp team. You had the ability to search by keyword instead of searching by the precise title of an app. And they were doing a lot of things that Apple would eventually do with the iOS 11 App Store. And I know quite a few folks who used to work at Chomp and then moved onto the App Store team at Apple.
Oh, okay.
So I don't know what took Apple so long. Of course, Apple, in terms of curation and sort of bringing the human aspect to the App Store, of course, with iOS 11, we got this major revamp of the App Store with the Today tab and the stories and the apps and games separation.
Mm-hmm.
But I think over the years, you can see the evolution because Apple was doing curation on the App Store before iOS 11, of course.
Right.
It was just not very well promoted. It was inconsistent.
Yeah, I think a big part of what happened with the App Store and why it has taken as long as it has is the fact that it was originally built for music. And so they were building on technology and a back end that was never designed to be an app store. And I think it just took a long time to migrate that to something that would work with apps.
2013, Apple acquires Q, which is not Eddie Q, but it's the it's the name of an app that used to be called Grappling. And Grappling, I'm pretty sure it's a programmer pun.
Mm-hmm.
Grep, I think, is a search command in the terminal. But the idea of Q is that it was a social search service. So I used to be a paying customer, I think, of Grappling at some point. So the idea was you connect all of your social and web accounts. So you connect your Twitter, your Facebook, your Gmail, your Dropbox, and you get a single search bar, and you can search for anything. You can search for messages you've sent to folks on Twitter. You can search for file names for your PDF documents in Dropbox. You can search for emails. So it was like a single search bar for anything that you do.
Which you kind of have in iOS now, right?
It's kind of the same, but also Q was heavily web-based, whereas Spotlight now can only search the contents of local files and data that you have in apps installed on your device. You cannot say, I don't have Dropbox on my device, but let me connect my account in the settings. Spotlight is not like Q. Q allowed you to go on a website and connect your third-party services and search from there without having to download anything, any app or any additional plugin. It was really different, although the idea is kind of the same as Spotlight.
The next app that we want to talk about is Test Flight, and it's probably probably not an app that a lot of listeners use themselves, but it's a developer tool for sharing betas. And before Test Flight, getting betas was really difficult because you had to
it was a nightmare.
You had to give out your UUID for your phone or your iPad, which was, it's just a long, complicated string of numbers that it made it tedious. And it was tedious on the other end too for developers. I mean, you really couldn't handle large numbers of beta testers because you were constantly managing UUIDs, and someone would upgrade their phone and then they couldn't get your beta, and there were so many problems with it. And when Apple acquired it in 2014, it came as a little bit of a surprise, and folks were wondering, is this going to just become part of Xcode? Is this going to be just subsumed within iTunes Connect? How is it going to fit within the rest of the developer tools that Apple makes? And they've left it as a separate standalone app, and it's improved over the years, but it still has the same name of the company that originally built it. I mean, I remember going to WWDC in 2013 and coming home with a Test Flight T-shirt. It was about 6 months before they got acquired.
Yeah, the parent company called Burstly, and besides Test Flight, they also they started making more developer tools such as analytics, tracking, insights about user engagement and all that type of stuff, mobile ads, I think at some point.
Right.
And you can see like how all of these features eventually found their way onto iTunes Connect and the test flight that developers have today. But it was a really different time for being an iOS app reviewer on a website, because having betas back then used to be really prestigious just because the system was so complex and the slots that developers had to let other people test their apps were limited. So now, of course, you can invite up to 10,000 people on a test flight. So it's really different.
I probably will get the number wrong, but I think when test flight was acquired, the number might have been limited to 100.
Yeah.
It's pretty small. It's interesting because those analytics, they took a while to make their way into iTunes Connect, but they did eventually get in there. And I think it's been pretty great for developers. It's not always 100% bug free, but I've enjoyed using test flight myself.
SnappyCam. This was acquired in 2014. And I remember this application for the iPhone because it was doing burst mode. I think before the iPhone had a burst mode feature.
Yes.
Maybe. So this was clearly an acqui-hire for getting the folks from SnappyCam and their technology and their expertise to join Apple.
It was one particular guy in Australia who figured out how to do this with the iPhone's hardware before Apple did. So, they did what you might expect, and they hired him by acquiring his app.
Of course. That's what they do when they want to make something disappear and eventually reappear as an iOS feature. Beats Music. This is, I would argue, the second biggest acquisition in recent memory from Apple. They acquired Beats in 2014, and along with the Beats hardware division, they also acquired Beats Music, and they brought on board, very famously, Jimmy Iovine and Dr. Dre. And eventually, for the relaunch of Apple Music, it was an entire team with the Beats One radio service that is still going on. And I remember Beats Music because at the time I switched from Spotify to Beats Music. Apple Music did not exist yet. And I was impressed by Beats Music, even though the tech press had in many ways underestimated Beats Music, because nobody believed that Beats, the makers of the fancy headphones that didn't sound great and were just fashionable, they didn't believe that they could make an actual solid streaming service, but they did. And they made one of the most remarkable and unique products that I had seen at the time, with a focus on curation,
right,
and on superior organization of music releases and artist pages that wanted to bundle, in addition to music releases, also stuff like merchandising and concert tickets. Beats Music was doing some incredible things at the time, and I'm still sad, not to mention the sentence, the feature that allowed you to create playlists on the fly by specifying verbs and locations and names. It was really, really fun and impressive. And I'm sad that so many of these features, they haven't been converted to Apple Music. For example, Apple Music now, if you go to an artist page, all of their albums and singles and EPs and compilations are mixed together in a single scroll view that is unusable. Whereas Beats Music, 4 years ago, they were doing an intelligent separation of different types of releases. They were really ahead of their time. And I'm sad that, when they got incorporated with Apple and eventually became Apple Music, they lost some of these crazy, well-done features along the way.
Yeah, that album display feature was really nice. And it's a problem that's only gotten worse because nowadays people release, an album's coming 6 months down the road, and the artist will release singles every single month until almost the whole album is filled up when it actually comes out. So you have singles, you'll go into Apple Music and there's singles just everywhere for particular artists. And I think what made Beats Music unique too had a lot to do with the fact that it was people in the music industry using technology to make a streaming service, not engineers at a technology company reaching out to the music industry.
A lot of people were really surprised when Apple acquired Swell in 2015. This was a podcasting app that brought some of the discovery ideas from services like Pandora Music to talk radio, to podcasts. It allowed you to like and dislike certain shows, certain podcasts from the iTunes Store directory, so the one that we still use, that is still around. It essentially allowed you to listen to podcasts as if they were an intelligent radio station, where you could say, I want more of this, I want less of these types of programs. And it's been shut down, and the current podcasts app for iOS doesn't have any of these intelligent recommendations. There's not a feature in the current podcasts app by Apple that says, here's a mix of shows made for you, or here's something you should listen to that is not already in your library.
Right.
There is no intelligence in podcasts, unlike Apple Music, which does offer some mixes. So I don't know what became of this acquisition, honestly.
Yeah, I know. It's been a whole 3 years at this point.
Now, of course, we skip ahead a few years. There's been a few other acquisitions in the middle that I don't want to talk about because also nothing became of them most of the time. But there's a big one. So we jump to March 2017, where I was in my kitchen. I was just minding my own business. It was late at night. It was after dinner. And someone sent me, I don't remember who, maybe on Twitter or a DM, I think it was a DM, that CoverFlow had been acquired. Now, CoverFlow, of course, it was my favorite app and still is my favorite app on my iOS devices. And Apple acquired CoverFlow, and it's been an Apple app for over a year at this point. It's still around. Apple is still releasing updates, although at a slower pace than, the CoverFlow team. They were really aggressive in growing CoverFlow.
They were
shipping update after update and major new features after major new features. They were just relentless in evolving CoverFlow. And of course, the pace of development has kind of slowed down, but I'm pretty confident that Apple is doing something with CoverFlow to have a real CoverFlow 2.0, either as a separate app or as a system feature eventually on iOS. I don't know what it is. Some people like to speculate that it's going to be some kind of Siri product. Other folks like to think that it's the future of Automator. There's Automator on the Mac and there's CoverFlow on iOS. I don't know what they're doing, but honestly, the Siri integration theory wouldn't surprise me. It's something that I think TechCrunch reported in the original story about the acquisition last year. I'm super happy that CoverFlow is still around. I still use CoverFlow. I'm glad that they're still releasing updates, but I want to know what's coming next.
Yeah, I do too. It's funny. I remember where I was too when that was announced because it just came out of the blue, and we were so shocked. And we were, you and I and a bunch of our friends were all talking about it for days after that. The next acquisition I want to mention is Bedit, because Bedit is a health and fitness, falls into the health and fitness category. It's a sensor, and I know you've tried this. I have not, but it was a sensor that you put under your mattress, I believe, and then it was an app as well, right, to track sleeping.
Yes, it was, and it didn't last long because, first of all, Sylvia was really against this idea of having a sensor under the sheets. And also, my dogs would just destroy this in 20 seconds.
And then we get to Shazam, which is one of the, other than Texture, it's the most recent acquisition that was public. And that, Shazam's been around, it's been around since the earliest days of iOS. And it was built, some of the features were built right into iOS 8.
Yes.
And it got acquired. When was the acquisition? Was it end of last year, I think?
It was last year. It still needs to be approved officially by regulators. I think they have either until the end of March or the end of April to decide whether they can approve the Shazam Apple deal. Yeah.
And then Texture, right? I mean, we talked a little bit at the top of the show about Texture, but what to me was interesting about this is it's not a particularly big acquisition, but it was announced with a press release, in part because Eddie Q was appearing at South by Southwest and talking a little bit about Apple's media strategy.
I would recommend listeners to check out the latest episode of Connected. Mike and I talked for like 40 minutes about Texture and the implications of Apple owning this kind of deal with the publishers and recommending sources in Apple News. It's a really interesting topic, especially considering the current political situation everywhere around the world, essentially, of how do you manage, news sources? How do you make an aggregation service like Apple News without, involving bias? Or do you want to have editors that push some kind of ideology or some kind of agenda? It's a really complex topic. But the idea is that Texture was A subscription service is a subscription service that lets you pay $10 a month and you get access to all these 200 magazines. So all the most popular magazines in the US, you can read them through Texture. But what sets it apart is the technology that allows the service to extract individual stories from magazines and recommend them to you in a highlight page. And this fits perfectly with Apple News, where you can subscribe to individual sources like Mac Stories or Apple Insider or The Verge or the New York Times. And then there's a single page named For You where you can jump to individual stories that have either been manually handpicked by Apple's editors or recommended by you by the algorithm and by your preferences. So it's interesting to me. I don't know what Apple wants to do with Texture, if it's just about the deals with the publishers, or if it's about the technology, or if it's more of a power move in the sense of the prestige of Apple working directly with these magazines and these institutions in the journalistic world. I don't know what it is, but it's a fascinating acquisition, if only because Apple made a big deal out of it in the public.
Right. And I think that's a good transition into some of the themes that you can see in these apps that we've been discussing, because usually, unlike Texture, Apple doesn't say anything about these acquisitions. And that's, I think, in large measure because there's a strategy behind each one of these acquisitions, and Apple really doesn't want to reveal where it's going. And you can't necessarily, you can sometimes get an idea of maybe what an acquisition is for when you get wind of it, but it's never particularly clear. And there's some of these apps that we've talked about where it's still not clear. But there are others, like if you look at things like CoverFlow and HopStop, where it seems like it was probably a technology play for the IP more than anything else, because those features, some of those features were incorporated into existing products, and other ones just kind of disappeared or were for, I suppose, more of an acqui-hire than they were for the technology themselves.
Yeah, and it doesn't help that in other cases where for apps like Workflow, for example, where there's a community of thousands and thousands of iOS users who depend on the app to get work done on iOS. And since the acquisition, there's been these doubts and questions going around of, well, do I want to commit to learning this app because it will eventually go away?
Right.
And of course, Apple doesn't say what they want to do with the Workflow app. Of course, when they acquire these companies, the original teams, they have to sign NDAs and they have to keep quiet and basically shut up and get to work. And so we are in this split scenario where there's a Workflow app still on the App Store, still being updated, but at a much, much slower pace compared to the past. And the lingering question of, will this eventually go away? Do I want to spend weeks learning advanced workflows? Do I want to put together these crazy workflows that have dozens of actions if they go away by the time that iOS 12 or iOS 13 ship? So it doesn't help that Apple's approach to secrecy, which I totally understand, but for existing products and especially for productivity stuff that people use to get work done, being quiet only causes more questions. Now, I'm not saying that Apple should be upfront with all the acquisitions that they make, but maybe there's a middle ground. Although I'm pretty sure we'll never get the middle ground because they prefer to keep the secrecy approach too much. And so that's why we do these podcasts, because we can speculate about what's going to happen.
And nobody's going to tell us we're wrong because they can't talk about it.
We can be right and we can be wrong.
Exactly. Well, test flight, I think, is probably the closest thing to your middle ground because
maybe, yeah.
That got acquired and there was immediately concern in the developer community about what would happen. And so there was a bit of an exodus towards hockey, for instance, and hockey was used for a while. And then hockey ended up getting acquired by Microsoft. But
yes,
then we got to WWDC and Apple said, hey, test flight, it's a thing. We're just going to keep doing it. And everything was good. And they did a fairly good job of getting that rolled out quickly and adding features so that people got comfortable with it. And it's just so much more convenient now that it's part of the actual system that it's even better than it was when it was a third-party app.
So we'll see what happens. I mean, I want to believe that, of course, I'm close to Workflow, so I want to believe that it will follow the same path of Siri and test flight. But, you never know. So
All right, Federico. Well, I think that's probably good for this week. I want to thank our sponsor again, FlightLogger, for making this episode possible. If you haven't checked out appstories.net, why don't you go over there and check it out, because we keep the show notes there and you can listen to the show and do those sorts of things. And as always, you can find both of us writing on macstories.net, and Federico's on Twitter. He's at Viticci, that's VITICCI, and I'm at John Voorhees, JOHNVOORHWES. Talk to you next week, Federico.
Ciao, John.